Now, there were 56 delegates who signed the parchment of paper. That's a question, by the way, is on one of your sheets there. So, and it's already been answered for you, so you didn't have to answer it. So, it is now in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. John Hancock of Massachusetts was president of the Second Continental Congress. He wrote his name. I thought this was so funny. He wrote his name in big letters just so everybody would know that he signed that thing. He was very proud of it. Every one of these men were proud that they signed the Constitution. And so he wrote his name so big that there was no doubt about it. They were proud for the rest of their lives. This announcement to the rest of the world was that the 13 colonies was now free. Anyway, they were so proud, and they were determined to defend the Constitution with their very lives and their fortunes. The question comes to us today, what will we pay for our freedom? One of our young American lives over on foreign soil is too cheap. It's too expensive, And it's a cheap price to pay for what we have. But it's so expensive, I don't think one life should have to be shed. But we may have to shed our lives to keep our freedom. What is freedom worth to us? To our forefathers, it was a matter of life. They had lived under British rule all of their lives. You've got to remember, whenever they sent people to the United States, what were they? A bunch of misfits, most of them. Some were religiously kicked out of England. Some were all kinds from all areas kicked out and sent to the New World just to get rid of them. When they started prospering and began to be worth something and getting rich, then they would like to have taken them over. And they tried it. But they risked their fortunes. All of them risked their lives, especially treason. Had the King of England have won, British would have won, those guys surely would have been hung at the gallows. And so we regard the declaration of something sacred. I know to me, and I've just had a revival of the Constitution in the last few years. And I think we'll hope we'll carry this revival forward because the Constitution must be taught. It must be kept. It must be honored. It is sacred. And it is that which gives us our right and our freedoms to worship our Lord and to have religious freedom. By the way, the next greatest thing right now I'm being told is that the government's coming after churches. You know what happens there, don't you? They'll come after preachers. Now, so Americans call them patriots. We regard the Declaration of Independence as something that is sacred, that we believe our forefathers fought for, and they did it for us. I remember both my uncles were in World War II. One of them was a tank driver. One was a dog-faced soldier, and both of them spent 3 years overseas. And they came back, and they wouldn't even tell about the atrocities that they'd seen, how terrible it was. They wouldn't even talk about it. And you know what they said? They did it for me and for the rest of our family and for their wives and for other kids so that we wouldn't have to go. Now, it's a declaration of the rights of all men in all countries. If we had our way about it, every country in this world would have the same freedoms we have, but they wouldn't give it up. I wouldn't think they'd want to give it up the way we're giving ours up, and I think that's terrible. So these 56 delegates were willing to die for our freedom. They had had freedoms under British rule. Now listen to this. The British left them alone. They had some freedoms. First of all, the legislature, their own, at Williamsburg, Boston, Annapolis, and some of these kids. So they would have their legislature that would meet and pass rules and ordinances, and they were kind of ruling themselves. And then they could manage their own affairs. They had light taxes, and not like some provisions of the Navigation Act. Now, the Navigation Act required them to do business only with England. That was the Navigation Act. Need to put that up here. Write that down. Navigation Act required to do business only with England. Well, now all of a sudden they're starting to infringe on their rights. Now, however, the British government kind of let that slide a little bit, and the colonists depend on England to protect them. Now, the big thing going on then was the French and Indian War, okay? And the French was over in the United States. The colonies were afraid that the French might take over the colonies. They were depending on England for support and to fight and to protect them. Our country ought to protect our citizens, ought to protect our borders, ought to protect our citizens. And I'm sorry to say, but our borders are not being protected right now. Y'all need to write that down now. These are some of the things that we're seeing that we're losing the battle on. and our constitutional rights. We're not being protected. And that's a big one to me. Anyway, when the French and Indian War ended, the colonists decided they could get along without British rule. And the main reason was because, guess what? Britain spent so much money on the war. They needed money. The King George, in particular, and the Parliament decided they would impose taxes on the citizens of the colonies. Have you ever had a tax imposed upon you that won't? Have you had health care imposed upon you that you don't want? Have you had things imposed? Well, sure you have. And so at the end of that French and Indian War, then they had to have money. So they started off. One of the first things the king did, he started by taxing them. The Stamp Act, which said they had to have stamps to buy everything from playing cards to legal paper to things like that. And the colonies said, we have no representation, and so we have taxation without representation. We're not going to do it. The king backed down. He dropped it. So the king decided then he'd come back and he'd enforce the trade law, which means that they could only trade with England. Well, that was another sore spot. Not only that, but then the king kept soldiers in colonies that they didn't need to be there. The redcoats were tough. They were stone-faced, and they fired upon the crowd and killed a few people at that time, and they called this the Boston Massacre. Do you remember that? Hey, you remember your history. Good girl. And anyway, and so the colonists were refused to buy British goods. They said, we're loyal to you, but we're not going to give up our rights at any cost. I wish I could say today that we didn't give up our rights without cost, but we did, and we are, and we're continuing. And believe me, the way it's going right now, there's more of our rights being taken away from us that we don't know about. And I'm shuddered to know how much of our rights have been taken away just while we're standing here, you know. Now, the next thing in 1773 came along was the Boston Tea Party. We know about that, don't we? The colonists dressed like Indians. They went in and they unloaded 3 ships and they poured it all in the ocean. What we don't know about after that, do you know what happened to Massachusetts? The king and the Parliament so disciplined them that they took away their freedoms, and they made them, the rest of the colonies were afraid they were going to lose their freedom like Massachusetts did. And listen, I'm going to tell you all what. We are not going to really appreciate our freedoms until we lose them. Unless we get on the ball, they're just about gone. We've got some chance at voting right now to change our country. And we better change our country. We better change our representatives and our senators and send them back with a new mandate. Hey, listen, boys, Constitution's in place. You better get busy upholding it. Now, so the British government punished them severely, and the other colonies were so afraid of them. I read recently where that there, over 51% of the people today, y'all got to go. God bless you. Thank you for being here. No problem. Over 51% of the people today are more afraid of the government than they are of IRS. Can you believe that? And maybe good reason. Okay, then came the Intolerance Act. 1774 was the first Continental Congress, and they said then, the Intolerable Act, no ship could sail out of Boston Harbor. They locked them down. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you what, that's terrible. Because the British were just flat shutting them down. And so, but the British then changed their form of government. See, where before they had the freedom to tax, they had the freedom to move about, and they had freedoms. And so then the British took it away from them. So they tried to stop the meetings that they were having in for their colonies were having for their legislatures and for people to meet. So he clamped down on that. And then he would not allow the Massachusetts even to manage their affairs at all. He flat shut down Massachusetts totally. Then, so this crisis was one of the first Continental Congress met to deal with. Other colonies supported Massachusetts and supported their freedom. Now, the farmers took up their axes and their tools, and they started fighting the British. And then, you might know it, then the fighting was Lexington and Concord. Y'all remember that, don't you? Lexington and Concord. That's where it got started. And today, Maine and Massachusetts celebrate that day called Patriots' Day to them. And so blood flowed at Bunker Hill. American blood. King George called them rebels. He sent troops to put them in their place. Some soldiers were German mercenaries, which he hired from the king of the Hessian ruler of Germany. He hired these mercenaries to come over here. You know why? Think about it. They wouldn't hesitate to kill these Americans, whereas some of the others might be a little bit loyal and since they're all Americans, or they're all British and they were British friends, they would be less likely to fight against them. So they called in these mercenaries to fight them instead. That's kind of dirty pool, wasn't it? And so guess what the colonies did? They elected George Washington. Great selection, don't you think? I don't think they could have elected a better person. Did you know what they took out of the history book in the 50s? The story about George Washington. He was in a battle. He got shot 4 times right here. And he was still walking alive. And this is a letter he wrote to his mother. And these miracles happened. And old George, God was just blessed him to keep him going. Later, do y'all know this story?
No.
Well, later, George, and then this 10, 15 years later, George and I were meeting with some of these Indians, and the Indian chief said, I was one of the people who I shot at you 16 times. And I think they had some kind of a name. I can't remember what kind of a name for him they gave him. But they shot at him 16 times. Go ahead. What was it? Bulletproof George Washington. There you go. Way to go. And now, so then the people, though, they're fighting for their independence. But guess what? They had lived under British rule all their lives. They didn't know anything but British rule. They loved the British flag. They really had love for the country and would like to have served it, but the king was just pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. And so they hated to give up their British flag after living under it all their lives. But this man called Thomas Paine, you know what he did? He wrote a little pamphlet. Does anybody know what it was called? My goodness. Yeah, I'm impressed. Now, so Thomas Paine wrote this booklet. He said this: no sense in having a king that it was observed for a big continent to be ruled by a small island. People in all the colonies urged them to declare their independence. So Paine was one of the main ones who wrote this pamphlet. People got hold of it and they believed it, and so they went ahead and to fight for the right. In July the 2nd, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia presented a resolution, and the first sentence states this: a decent respect to the opinions of mankind required that they should declare the causes of painful separation from their home country. Now, he used the word painful separation. Now, the Declaration says this: what all men are born equal in rights because they're human beings. Now, that's what it meant right there, exactly. They have rights to live, to be free, and to be happy. Do y'all agree with that?
Yes.
Sure. Our Constitution says we should have that right. The government was set up to protect the lives of people, liberties, the happiness of the people. The government exists for no other reason but to protect its people, to care for them, and to see to it that they're taken care of. Folks, are you leaving? God bless you. Okay. I'm glad y'all came. Thank you so much. And so the Declaration said then that men should always resist tyranny. Do you all agree with that? Wait a second. Why are we not resisting the tyranny that's upon us?
Look, tyranny comes at night and it comes in uniform.
True. We're still going to have to stand someplace. There has to be a place where we stand. On June 11, 1776, Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 men to draft the Declaration of Independence. Now, y'all know who they were, don't you? Y'all can probably tell me. John Adams was one of them, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, who actually wrote the first draft, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. I couldn't name all 5 of those. You know what? I should be able to, but I couldn't anymore. I will one of these days. I will learn this Constitution enough that I'll be able to repeat some of these things. On June the 28th, 1776, they submitted the Continental Congress their final approval, and which they approved on July 4th, 1776, which is coming up when? Monday, July the 4th. I hope because of this class that come this July the 4th, it's going to be a lot more meaningful because we've had a refresher and a revival of the Constitution.